I never thought the night my son invited me to his family vacation would end with me sleeping in a hotel lobby. He'd said, "Mom, we booked 3 rooms, one for us, one for the kids, one for Victoria's parents. You don't mind waiting in the lobby, right?" Then he laughed like it was funny. So there I sat in my best Sunday dress, clutching the little gift bags I'd made for my grandchildren, while strangers walked past pretending not to see me. Hours passed. My phone stayed silent. No call, no text, just the echo of my son's voice and the sting of shame I couldn't wash away. At 3 a.m., a man in a dark suit stopped in front of me, the hotel manager. He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Ma'am, your penthouse is ready." I thought it was a mistake, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of something I never saw coming, a story of betrayal, redemption, and justice 30 years in the making. And when I tell you who really owned that hotel and why my son should have never left me waiting, you'll understand. The lobby was just the beginning. My name is Mary Chen. I'm 60 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and a widow of 5 years. These days, my life is quiet and small. I live in a little house on the edge of town, surrounded by rose bushes I planted myself. Most mornings, I tend the garden, then teach English to immigrant children at the community center 3 times a week. It's a simple life, but it's peaceful. At least it was until the day my son called. It was late Friday afternoon, and I was folding laundry when the phone rang. I saw Ethan's name on the screen and felt that familiar rush of warmth and worry. He didn't call often, mostly short texts on birthdays or holidays, the kind that ended with "Love you, Mom," but never came with a visit. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered quickly. "Mom," he said, his voice brisk and distracted. "We're going to the Walker Grand Hotel this weekend. Family vacation. You should come." For a moment, I didn't say anything. It had been over 6 months since I'd last seen him, and I hadn't met my new grandson yet. "You mean it?" I asked softly. "You want me to come?" "Of course," he said. Victoria thought it'd be nice. Victoria. My daughter-in-law. Elegant, polished, always composed. She came from money, and I always felt a little out of place around her. Still, I tried to tell myself this invitation was a good sign, maybe things were changing. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand. Then, almost giddy, I went to my dresser and opened the little box where I kept my savings. I wasn't rich, just a small pension and what I earned tutoring, but I wanted to bring gifts. It had been so long since I'd seen my grandchildren. I used 2 weeks' worth of my pension, about $400, to buy something for each of them. A handmade picture book for Emily, who was 5 and loved stories, a toy truck for little Max, who was 2, and a silk scarf for Victoria, something elegant, tasteful, something she might actually wear. And for Ethan, I packed the old blue scarf I'd knitted when he was 7, the one he used to wear to school every winter. I'd kept it all these years folded neatly in my drawer. Maybe I'd give it back to him, just as a small reminder of home. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting to old memories. Ethan at 7, lying in a hospital bed with pneumonia, his small hand gripping mine. I'd stayed awake 3 nights straight, afraid to close my eyes. On the 3rd night, when his fever finally broke, he whispered, "When I grow up, I'll take care of you forever, Mom, I promise." Promises made by children are the sweetest kind, even if time wears them thin. By Saturday morning, I was on my way to the Walker Grand Hotel, a suitcase by my side, my heart fluttering like a schoolgirl's. I'd asked Ethan earlier if he'd reserved a room for me, but he'd just said, "We'll figure it out." I took that as a yes. The taxi pulled up to the grand marble entrance, and for a moment, I felt small, like a speck in front of something too beautiful to touch. The doorman smiled politely as he helped me out. I could see Ethan and Victoria already at the front desk with the children. "Ethan," I called out, waving. He turned, gave a quick nod. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice, flat eyes back on the receptionist. Victoria stood beside him in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. When her gaze fell on the gift bags in my hand, wrinkled brown paper tied with string, her expression tightened. She leaned toward Ethan, whispering something I couldn't hear. He just nodded. I walked closer, still smiling. "Which room am I in, sweetheart?" I asked. Ethan didn't look up. "Mom, we booked 3 rooms, one for us, one for the kids and the nanny, and one for Victoria's parents. They'll be here tomorrow." I blinked. "Oh, well, that's nice." "Which one?" He cut me off. "You don't mind waiting in the lobby for a bit, right? I'll call to book you something nearby." Nearby? The word hung in the air hollow. I felt the color drain from my face. "You didn't book one for me." He didn't answer. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, typed something quickly, then gestured to the bellboy. "Mom, I'll call you later. Okay?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My fingers trembled. The gift bag slipped from my hand and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The little toy truck rolled out, bumping against Ethan's shoe. He didn't even look down. Victoria reached for her designer purse and said to the bellboy, just loud enough for me to hear, "Leave that. It's just trash." They walked away, my son, his perfect wife, their perfect life, without turning back. And as I stood there in that glittering lobby surrounded by marble and strangers, one thought settled heavy in my chest. There was no nearby hotel. There was no call coming. There never was. The last thing I remembered from before was standing in that marble lobby, the sound of Victoria's heels fading into silence as she said to the bellboy, "Leave that. It's just trash." Then they were gone. I didn't chase after them. I couldn't. My body wouldn't move, as if every ounce of pride I had left was holding me still. I found a seat in the corner, a soft velvet sofa by the window. The hotel was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers, soft piano music, the scent of lilies in the air. But sitting there at 7 in the evening, I felt like a stain on the glass, something that didn't belong. I held my gift bags close, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe Ethan was just distracted, I told myself. Maybe he would come down after getting the children settled. Mothers are always the last to be remembered, but never truly forgotten. At least that's what I wanted to believe. By 9 o'clock, the lobby had emptied out. Couples in evening clothes passed me by, laughing softly as they went out for dinner. The front desk clerk changed shifts. The new one, a young woman with a neat bun, walked over and asked politely, "Ma'am, do you need help checking in?" I smiled, though my cheeks burned. "Oh, no," I said quickly. "My son will be down soon. He's just handling something." She nodded, and though she was kind enough not to press, I could see the pity in her eyes. At 11, I tried calling Ethan. 3 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. I texted Ethan, "I'm still in the lobby. Are you okay?" The message showed, read, but no reply came. I stared at the phone until the screen dimmed, the reflection of my face vanishing in the dark glass. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. It made my heart ache. By 1 in the morning, the lobby lights were dimmed for the night, the music replaced by silence. I was so tired. My back ached, my hands stiff from holding the bags too long. I finally let them rest on the floor beside me, then unfolded the old blue scarf I'd brought for Ethan and draped it across my lap. The wool was worn thin from years of keeping it close. As I ran my fingers over it, I felt the ghost of his small hand, warm and trusting when he was a boy who once promised to take care of me. I leaned back, meaning only to rest my eyes for a moment. When I opened them again, the clock on the wall read 2. The hotel was silent, except for the soft hum of the air vents. A few guests passed through, young people, still dressed from some party upstairs. One girl, maybe in her 20s, stopped for a moment. She looked at me, an old woman alone in a 5-star lobby, clutching a gift bag, a scarf across her knees, and I saw her expression change. Sadness. Maybe guilt. She hesitated, lifted her phone, and before I could ask what she was doing, a small flash went off. I didn't think much of it. I just smiled weakly out of habit. She murmured, "I'm sorry," and hurried away. I didn't know that within an hour, that photo would be all over the internet, thousands of strangers staring at my loneliness, calling me heartbreaking and forgotten. I didn't know that far above me, on the top floor of the same hotel, a woman named Sarah Walker would be staring at that picture on her screen, her heart pounding as she whispered, "It's her." But I did feel something then, a shift in the air, a faint stirring of kindness I hadn't expected. At around 3, I woke again to the sound of soft footsteps. A young woman stood beside me holding a folded cashmere blanket and a hotel keycard. She had kind eyes, the kind that had seen both power and pain. She knelt down so she was at my level and said quietly, "Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry you've been waiting. Your room is ready now." I blinked, confused. My voice came out hoarse. "My room? But I don't." She smiled gently, draping the blanket around my shoulders. "Come with me, ma'am," she said. "You've waited long enough." And so I went with her, half asleep, half afraid I was dreaming. My legs trembled as she helped me stand. The warmth of that cashmere blanket wrapped around my shoulders felt like the first kind touch I'd received in years. I followed her across the empty lobby, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. She introduced herself in the elevator. "I'm Sarah Walker," she said, her tone calm but tender. "Operations manager here at the Walker Grand." "I think there's a mistake," I murmured. "My son only booked standard rooms." "I can't afford." "There's no mistake, ma'am," she interrupted gently, "and there's no charge. Please, you've waited long enough." Her words confused me more than they comforted me. I stared at the glowing numbers on the elevator panel as they climbed past 20, 30, 40 floors. The higher we went, the tighter my chest felt. "Why are you doing this?" I finally asked. "I'm nobody." She turned toward me, her eyes unexpectedly soft. "You're not nobody, Mrs. Chen. You're someone very important." The elevator stopped at the top floor. She led me down a quiet hallway lined with gold-framed art and thick carpet that swallowed every sound. Then she unlocked a door, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. The suite stretched wider than my entire house, polished wood floors, tall glass windows overlooking the sleeping city, a grand piano near the balcony, and a vase of white roses blooming fresh on the table. Everything glowed under soft light, calm and unreal. I turned to Sarah. "There must be some confusion," I whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the table and handed me a small envelope sealed with black ink. "This was left for you," she said. My name was written on it in neat cursive, Mrs. Mary Walker. My hands shook as I opened it. The card inside read, "To Mrs. Mary Walker. You once helped me when no one else would. You lost everything because of me. This is the least I can do. Welcome home. D.W. Walker." I murmured, tracing the letters. That was my married name. But I haven't used it in 30 years. How did he? Sarah smiled faintly. "My father knew you by that name. He's kept your photo for 3 decades, hoping to find you one day." "Your father?" I looked up sharply. Who is he, Daniel Walker? She said quietly. He owns this hotel chain. She hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. He says you saved his life once, when no one else believed him. The name hit me like a rush of wind. For a moment, the room spun the weight of memory pressing down. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in so long, but I remembered it clearly. The young man with kind eyes, the one everyone had called a thief. The one I'd believed when no one else did. Sarah must have seen something in my face because she stepped closer. He'll be here soon, she said softly. Please rest, Mrs. Chen. There are clothes in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom, everything you might need. When she left the room, felt enormous and silent. I walked slowly to the window, looking out over the city lights, then turned to explore the suite. In the closet hung 3 simple dresses just my size. Someone had thought about me, not the image of me, but me. At the dressing table, I opened a drawer and found a wooden picture frame. My breath caught. It was a photo, me 30 years younger, standing behind a reception desk beside a man in a gray suit. Daniel Walker. His arm rested at his side, formal but grateful. And on the back of the frame were the words engraved in faint script to the woman who believed me when the world called me a thief. I never forgot your courage. D.W. 1995. I sat down, clutching the frame to my chest. Daniel, I whispered. You remembered. For the first time that night, tears came freely. Not of humiliation, but of release. The pain in my chest loosened, and in its place came something fragile and unfamiliar, the feeling of being seen. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back. A text from Ethan. Mom, where are you? The hotel said you're not in the lobby. Did you go home? I stared at it for a long moment, then pressed the side button and turned it off. For years, I had answered every call, every demand, every careless word out of fear of losing what little I had left. But that night in a penthouse I never expected, I chose silence. And somehow, that silence felt like freedom. I sat there for a long while after turning off my phone, the city lights flickering through the tall windows like distant stars. The room was quiet, but my thoughts were not. That card, those words written in careful black ink, had opened a door in my mind I thought I had locked decades ago. You once helped me when no one else would. Daniel Walker. The name echoed through me, soft at first, then sharper, cutting through years of memory I had tried to bury. It was 1995, and I was 30 years old. Back then, I still carried my married name, Mary Walker, though the marriage had ended in bruises and broken promises. Ethan was 5. I'd packed our things into 2 suitcases and left one night after my husband threw a bottle across the kitchen. I told myself I'd start over, but the truth was, I was just trying to survive. I found work at a small hotel outside Pittsburgh called the Rosewood Inn. $8 an hour at the front desk, plus whatever I could make cleaning rooms on weekends. It wasn't much, but it kept us fed. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in a building where the heat barely worked in winter. I used to wrap Ethan in 2 blankets at night and tell him stories about castles and kind kings who never forgot the people who helped them. I suppose I needed to believe in such stories myself. One night, late in November, I was working the graveyard shift when I saw him, Daniel Walker. He'd checked in earlier that week, a quiet man with tired eyes. That night, he was sitting in the lobby, long after midnight. His tie loosened, his hands pressed against his face. When I asked if he was all right, he looked up and said in a broken voice, I didn't do it. I swear I didn't. But no one believes me. I remember the fear in his voice. It was the sound of someone's life collapsing. The newspapers had been full of his story, accountant accused of embezzlement. They said he stole $200,000 from his company. But the man sitting before me didn't look like a thief. He looked like someone who had lost everything. Something in me refused to walk away. Over the next 3 nights, I stayed after my shift, quietly reviewing guest logs and security tapes. I knew I could get fired if anyone found out, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. Another guest, a man named Marcus Reed, using Daniel's spare keycard while I'd stepped away from the desk. He'd entered Daniel's room and left minutes later carrying a briefcase. The truth was, they're clear as daylight. I took the footage and the records to the police. They didn't want to listen at first. What did a front desk clerk know? But when they looked closer, they saw what I saw. A week later, Marcus Reed was arrested. Daniel was cleared of all charges. He came to the hotel the day I was fired. The manager called me into the office and told me I was being let go for breach of confidentiality and damage to the hotel's reputation. He said I was lucky he didn't press charges. When Daniel arrived, I was already packing my things. He tried to speak for me to defend me, but the manager wouldn't listen. I remember Daniel's face, grateful, guilty, and helpless. He told me one day, if life gives me a chance, I'll repay this debt. I promise, Mrs. Walker. But life didn't give either of us much. I was blacklisted, no hotel would hire me. I spent months scrubbing floors, washing dishes, doing anything I could. There were nights when Ethan and I lived on canned soup from the church pantry. I remember one winter, the pipes froze, and we sat in the dark, sharing a single blanket. Ethan didn't cry, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. 5 years later, when he was 10, we went back to Rosewood Inn to ask for my last paycheck, $2,000 they still owed me. The same manager looked me in the eye and laughed. "You're the woman who begged for strangers," he said. "You ruined your life for a man you didn't even know. Now you come here begging again." Ethan stood outside the office door listening. He saw the way people stared at me, the pity, the contempt. Something in him hardened that day. I didn't know it then, but that was the day I lost him. Not his love, but his belief in me. He decided he would never be poor, never be humiliated, never be like me. Now, sitting in the quiet of the penthouse, I held the old photo frame in my lap, the one I'd found in the drawer. Daniel's young face smiled back at me, the same kind eyes, the same gratitude. I traced the words on the back of the frame and whispered, "Ethan never knew the whole story. I never told him why we were so poor. I thought if I kept quiet, he wouldn't carry my shame. But maybe my silence made him ashamed of me instead." That thought lingered with me through the night. I didn't sleep much. The city below faded from gold to gray, and I sat by the window watching the sky lighten over the rooftops. It was strange being in a place so beautiful and feeling so small inside it. The penthouse still smelled of roses from the vase on the table. The note from Daniel lay open beside me, the ink starting to blur where my tears had fallen. I kept tracing his initials DW, trying to understand what kind of kindness could survive 30 years. At 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on the door. For a moment, I thought it might be hotel staff, but something in my chest stirred a quiet recognition, a heartbeat from another lifetime. When I opened the door, the man standing there looked older, grayer, but his eyes, I knew those eyes. "Mrs. Walker," he said, his voice trembling, then more softly. Or should I say, "Mrs. Chen?" For a moment I couldn't breathe. "Daniel," I whispered, "is it really you?" He nodded, and before I could say another word, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't the kind of embrace between strangers. It was something deeper, like two people finding each other after being lost for too long. "I've been looking for you for 30 years, he said, his voice breaking. "Thank God you're alive." When we finally sat down, I could see the weight of time on him, the fine lines, the silver in his hair, but also something bright in his eyes, something like peace. He told me what had happened after that night so long ago. The company that had accused him of theft had been forced to pay him $500,000 in damages. He used that money, he said, to open a small hotel in 1998, the Walker Inn, named not for himself, but for me. Every hotel I built after that, he said I built in memory of the woman who believed in me when no one else would. I didn't know what to say. My throat closed around the words. He continued telling me about the years that followed, how his little inn grew into a chain of 12 hotels across the country. Each one, he said smiling, was built on the belief that decency still mattered. Then more softly, "You saved more than my job, Mary. You saved my life." Just then, a knock sounded again, and a young woman entered, carrying a tray with tea. "Mrs. Chen," she said warmly, "it's so good to finally meet you." It was Sarah Daniels' daughter, the same woman who had found me sleeping in the lobby. She set the tray down and smiled, a mirror of her father's gentleness. "I've heard about you my whole life," she said. "My father told me, if not for Mrs. Walker, I would have gone to jail. You wouldn't have had a father." I grew up knowing I owe my life to a woman I'd never met. I felt tears gather in my eyes. "You owe me nothing," I said quietly. "I just did what was right." Daniel shook his head. "No, Mary." Everyone else turned away. Only you stood up. The kindness in their eyes was almost too much to bear. I looked around the room. The fresh clothes folded neatly, the roses on the table, the sunlight pouring across the piano, and I felt the weight of it all pressing against my chest. "This penthouse," I said softly. "It's too much, Daniel. I can't accept this." "It's not enough," he said simply. "It will never be enough." I tried to smile, but my heart pulled elsewhere. "My son," I murmured. "Ethan, he doesn't know I'm here. He must be worried." Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance, quiet and knowing. They didn't tell me what they'd seen on the cameras, that Ethan had walked away without a word, that I'd sat in that lobby for 6 hours, waiting for a call that never came. Daniel's voice was gentle when he asked Mary, "May I ask you something? Why was your son not with you last night?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the teacup. He was busy with his family," I said. "It was just a misunderstanding." Sarah didn't speak, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the kind that comes from truth too painful to name. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I looked down. 5 missed calls from Ethan. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. Then slowly, I turned the phone face down. For 35 years, I had answered every call, every plea, every cruel silence. But not this time. This time, I chose to let it ring. When I looked up, Daniel was watching me quietly. He reached for Sarah's hand and gave a small nod. Neither of them said a word, but I could see it in their faces. They both knew something inside me had broken long before that night. And something else, fragile but real, had just begun to heal. That fragile feeling of peace lingered with me for days. For the first time in years, I woke up without the heaviness that used to greet me in the mornings. Sarah had sent up breakfast that first Monday, eggs toast and a small pot of tea, and a handwritten note that said, "Please stay as long as you like." I spent the morning by the window again, watching the city move below me. I didn't go home. I didn't even think about it. The house would be quiet, and the roses would have wilted by now. Somehow I wasn't ready to return to that silence. Instead, I found myself walking the hotel corridors, with Sarah listening to her stories about growing up around the business her father built. Daniel visited often, too. We talked about old times, about the strange turns life takes when you least expect it. There was no judgment in his eyes, only gratitude. He told me I had given him the courage to rebuild when everyone else turned away. I told him I hadn't been brave, I had just done what I thought was right. Still, the words meant something. They stitched together small holes I didn't realize had been tearing in me for years. But that peace didn't last long. By Thursday afternoon, Sarah came into the suite with a look of concern. "Mrs. Chen," she said gently, "has your son tried to reach you again?" I hesitated before answering. I hadn't turned my phone back on since that morning Daniel first came to see me. I was afraid of what might wait on the screen. His voice, his anger, or worse, his silence. I told her no, and she only nodded, though I caught the shadow in her eyes before she turned away. That evening, I found out later, Ethan had gone back to my house. He must have been expecting to find me there, maybe waiting for him with tea, like I always did when he visited. But the door would have been locked, and the garden still untended. The neighbor, Mrs. Tan, probably told him I hadn't been home since Friday. I can imagine the confusion that must have flickered through him, how quickly confusion can turn into suspicion when pride is involved. On Friday morning, the phone in the suite rang. Sarah answered before I could reach it, her tone calm and professional. When she hung up, she looked at me carefully. "That was the front desk," she said. "Your son is here." I felt my breath catch. "Ethan?" She nodded. "He was asking if you were staying at the hotel. We told him as per policy that we can't disclose guest information." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or guilty. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my cup. Sarah put her hand over mine. "He seemed upset," she said carefully. Later that day, Daniel stopped by. He told me quietly that Ethan had demanded to speak to the manager and had been told that I was the personal guest of Mr. Daniel Walker, staying in the Walker suite. I could see the discomfort in Daniel's face. As he said it, he didn't want to embarrass me. I only nodded, though I could picture Ethan's reaction. My son, the man who built his life on appearances, finding out his mother was staying in a penthouse she hadn't paid for. I imagined the conversation that must have followed between him and Victoria. I knew her type well. Elegant, proud, sharp as glass. I could almost hear her voice dripping with contempt. "Your mother is staying in a penthouse with a rich old man. Ethan, this is a scandal." And Ethan caught between denial and doubt, saying, "She's not like that. She wouldn't." But he wouldn't sound sure, not completely. Because when pride cracks, fear seeps in. That night I sat alone by the window again. The city lights looked different now, as if something had shifted. I could almost feel his presence somewhere below, restless and watching. And I was right. Later, I would learn that he stood outside the hotel for a long time, staring up at the top floor, trying to understand what his mother was doing in a world that had nothing to do with him. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, but I didn't. All I felt was a strange ache, like a thread pulled tight between us, about to snap. He thought I was hiding something. He was right in a way. I was hiding a truth he'd never been ready to face, that I didn't belong to his world anymore. And as the night deepened, I could almost see him out there in the darkness. His face lit faintly by the streetlights, eyes fixed on the penthouse windows. For the first time in his life, my son was afraid, not of what I might lose, but of what I might finally say. That fear, I think, was what brought everything to the surface. The following Monday, I received a call from Daniel. His tone was different, steady, but weighted with something I couldn't quite place. "Mary," he said, "I need you to come to my office. There's something you should see." By then, I had grown used to quiet mornings and gentle company. Sarah had made it a habit to visit me daily, bringing tea and stories about her guests. It was the first time in years I'd felt surrounded by kindness without needing to earn it. So when Daniel called, my heart tightened. His voice didn't sound like friendship. It sounded like warning. The elevator to the 20th floor opened into his office, sleek and modern, with tall glass walls and a view that made the city look fragile beneath us. Daniel was standing by his desk, a laptop open before him. When he looked at me, his expression carried both concern and sorrow. "Mary," he said quietly, "I need to show you something. It's about your son." The words chilled me. "Ethan, is he in trouble?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I think you might be in trouble because of him." I stepped closer, my hands suddenly cold. On the screen was a website, clean, elegant, with a white and gold logo, shaped like a hand holding a rose. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Walker Hope Foundation." I frowned, leaning in. Then I froze. There on the banner was a photograph of me standing in my rose garden at home, watering the bushes, smiling at the sunlight. It was a picture I'd never taken for anyone. The title below read, "Founded by Mary Walker Chen, former single mother educator advocate." I could barely breathe. "What is this?" I whispered. "I never agreed to this. I never even heard of this foundation." Daniel's voice was steady, but grim. "I know. That's why I'm showing you." He scrolled down, revealing numbers: over $2 million in donations, photos of charity events, and testimonials praising Mary Walker Chen's courage and dedication. The sight made my stomach twist. Daniel tapped the screen. "This is a registered nonprofit," he explained. "On paper, it looks legitimate. But when my team investigated, we found that 90% of the donations are being funneled into shell companies owned by your son." My hands flew to my mouth. "Ethan is taking the money." He nodded slowly. "He's using the foundation's reputation to secure investors for his firm, Helix Holdings. The foundation gives him credibility. People believe he's helping single mothers when in truth he's helping himself." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe my son wasn't capable of something so cruel. But as Daniel spoke, a weight of realization settled in my chest. I had raised him to be proud, but somewhere along the way, pride had turned into greed. Then Daniel clicked another folder labeled emails. I read the first one, and my heart broke further. It was from Victoria. "Ethan, use your mother's backstory. The single mom who struggled narrative sells. People trust it. We can raise millions." Another email followed. "Don't bring her to events. She's too modest. She'll ruin the branding. Just use her photos." And the last one, dated just weeks ago: "I told you, don't invite her to the hotel. If she starts talking to people, someone might realize she's not actually involved. Keep her away." I stared at the words until they blurred. My throat burned. "Victoria planned this," I said, finally, my voice trembling. "All of this." Daniel's face softened with pity. "She comes from money, but her family's fortune is nearly gone. She needs Ethan's success to survive. And she knows if he ever softens toward you, if he ever gives you a share of his wealth, it's money she won't control." I pressed a hand to my chest. She turned him against me. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping the floor. "I need to talk to Ethan," I said. "Right now." "Mary, wait." Daniel reached for my arm. "If you confront him now, she'll twist the story. She'll make you the problem. You need to be careful." "He's my son," I said, pulling free. "I don't need a plan to talk to my son." The hallway outside was quiet. As I walked away, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't notice the figure standing by the corner until it was too late. Victoria. Her phone was raised, the camera light blinking red. She smiled, not with warmth, but with calculation. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Chen," she said softly. I froze. The air between us felt sharp enough to cut. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. The truth had just become dangerous. And I was right. For the next few days, that truth weighed on me like a stone I carried in my chest. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even look at my reflection without feeling a deep ache of betrayal. My own son had built his empire on the ruins of my dignity. Every dollar he made came from the same story that once cost me everything, the story of a woman who had nothing but her word, her courage, and her love for her child. By Friday, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I spent the morning pacing the penthouse, the letter from Daniel still open on the desk. The emails from Victoria burned into my mind. She had used Ethan's ambition like a weapon, and he had let her. But as much as I wanted to blame her, I knew my son wasn't innocent. He had made choices, selfish, cruel ones, and if I didn't stop him now, he'd drag that darkness even further. At 6 p.m, I called him. The line clicked after the second ring. His voice was sharp, rehearsed, almost cold. "Mom, we need to talk," I said. "Tonight." He paused. "Fine. 8 o'clock. The hotel restaurant." The call ended before I could reply. When I walked into the restaurant 2 hours later, he was already there, seated near the window with a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. His suit was perfect. His hair slicked back, but there was something brittle in his posture, as if he'd been preparing for war. When his eyes met mine, there was no warmth, only calculation. I sat down quietly. "Ethan," I began, keeping my voice steady. "I know about the Walker Hope Foundation." He didn't flinch. "So I was going to tell you. I was going to give you a cut. A cut. My name, my face, my story, and he thought he could pay me off. A cut," I repeated softly. "Ethan, you used me. You took my life and turned it into a brand without even asking." He leaned back, his expression tightening. "You should be grateful, Mom. I turned your pathetic story into something valuable. That poor single mother act made me millions." The words hit harder than any slap. I felt the room spin, but I held my ground. "Grateful." My voice broke, but I kept going. "You stole from people who believed in goodness, Ethan. You turned their hope into your profit." He slammed his hand against the table. "You don't understand." His voice rose, drawing stares from nearby diners. "Do you know how hard it is to build a reputation when everyone knows your mother was a poor hotel maid?" "I was never a maid," I said quietly. "I was a receptionist." Same difference, he spat. "You were poor, and you never let me forget it. Every time Victoria's friends asked about you, I had to lie. I told them you were a retired principal, not some woman who cleaned up after strangers." I stood, then trembling. "Is that why you left me in the lobby?" "Because I embarrassed you." His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. "I begged for your future once, Ethan," I said, my voice rising despite the tears. "I went on my knees for you. I worked until my hands bled, and you turned that sacrifice into shame." "I didn't ask you to beg," he shouted. "I didn't ask you to be a martyr. No," I said softly, "you didn't. But I did it anyway. Because I loved you, because I believed that one day you'd understand." He looked away, his chest heaving, his mask cracking just enough for me to see the boy. He used to be the one who promised he'd take care of me forever. "You swore you'd never be poor again," I whispered. "But somewhere along the way, you forgot what made you human." He didn't speak. His silence said more than his anger ever could. I gathered my purse, my coat, and what little strength I had left. It's time you remembered, Ethan, I said. Before you lose yourself completely. Then I walked away. Outside, the rain had begun to fall cold and steady against the pavement. I stood under the awning for a moment, breathing in the scent of wet asphalt and roses from the hotel garden below. Then I took out my phone and dialed Daniel. "I'll do it," I said when he answered. "I'll speak at the gala. But I need time to prepare." Behind me, through the reflection in the glass, I thought I saw a figure step out from behind a marble pillar. Tall, slim, her phone glowing faintly in the dark. Victoria. She lifted the device, typed something quickly, and pressed send. And in that single moment, I understood she wasn't finished yet. Those words lingered in my mind for days, circling like restless birds that refused to settle. Victoria wasn't finished, and neither, it seemed, was I. For most of my life, I had learned to endure quietly, to wait for storms to pass rather than stand against them. But something had shifted the night I walked away from Ethan. I had felt anger before sorrow too, but this was different. This was resolve. Daniel called me the following Monday morning. His voice was gentle, but beneath it was something more purposeful. "Mary," he said, "I think it's time we stop reacting and start acting." By the end of that call, I found myself sitting across from him in the conference room of Walker Group headquarters, surrounded by files, laptops, and the low hum of professionals who looked like they'd spent their lives handling crises much larger than mine. Daniel introduced them, his legal counsel, a financial investigator, a PR specialist named Lauren. "We'll need strategy," he said. "Your son is about to host a charity gala for the Walker Hope Foundation. It's 4 weeks from now, right here in this hotel. He's planning to bring you on stage to present you as the founder." I felt my stomach twist. "He's going to use me again," I whispered. Daniel nodded solemnly. "Yes, but that's exactly why this can work. We turn his stage into your stage." I hesitated. "You mean expose him in public?" His eyes met mine, firm but kind. "Mary, the people who donated to that foundation did so to help women like you. They deserve to know the truth." For a long time, I said nothing. The thought of humiliating my own son in front of hundreds of people made me feel physically ill. "But he's my child," I said finally. "If I do this, it will destroy him." Daniel sighed. "No, Mary. The lies will destroy him. You're just giving him the chance to stop before they do." It took me 3 days to agree. Not because I doubted Daniel, but because I needed to make sure I wasn't doing this out of anger. I had to be certain it came from truth and from love, even the painful kind that a mother carries long after everyone else has given up. By the 5th week, the plan was in motion. Daniel's team worked tirelessly, building a timeline of evidence emails between Ethan and Victoria bank records, showing the diverted funds and lists of investors who had unknowingly financed the fraud. Daniel even contacted the FBI and IRS himself, his voice steady and professional as he said, "We're reporting charity fraud." His lawyers insisted I be the one to speak. "You're the victim," Lauren told me. "Your testimony will make the truth impossible to ignore." I didn't like the word victim. It made me sound powerless, and I wasn't anymore. So I told them if I speak, it won't be for revenge. It will be for the people he deceived and for the son I lost to pride. Maybe this way he'll see himself clearly for the first time. It was around this time that I began noticing how tired Daniel looked. He'd brush it off with a smile, claiming long hours were catching up to him. But there was something deeper in the way his hands trembled when he reached for his coffee. One afternoon during a meeting, he coughed so hard he had to leave the room. I followed him into the hallway where he leaned against the wall, struggling to catch his breath. When he dropped his briefcase, I bent to pick it up, and that's when I saw it. A small amber bottle that had rolled from his pocket, the label clear Oncology, Pancreatic Cancer, Stage 4. I froze. Daniel. He looked at me, and in that moment I saw not the successful businessman or the man I'd once saved, but someone fighting time itself. He smiled faintly, his voice hoarse. 6 to 18 months, they said. 12 if I'm lucky. Tears filled my eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want pity, he said softly. I wanted purpose. I've spent 30 years building wealth, Mary. Now I want to spend what's left of my life building something right. I reached for his hand and he squeezed mine weakly. I'm not doing this for revenge, he continued. I'm doing it so Sarah doesn't inherit hatred. And so your son, if there's anything left in him worth saving, might remember who he was before the world told him success was everything. For the first time since all this began, I wept without shame. A few days later, I went to Sarah's office. The sunlight poured through the windows, and for a moment she looked so much like Daniel had 30 years ago, determined, kind, too brave for her own good. Sarah. I said, how did you know I'd be at the hotel that night? She went still. Mrs. Chen, tell me the truth. She hesitated, then sighed. I've been watching your son for 3 years, she confessed. Ever since I found out he was planning to take over my father's company. When I saw his reservation last month, 3 rooms, none under your name, I hired someone to be in the lobby that night, to take photos if what I suspected was true. I felt the air leave my lungs. You used me, I whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. I gave you the stage you deserve. Without that photo, you'd still be invisible, and your son would still be using you. I turned away, unable to meet her gaze. She had been right about one thing I had spent a lifetime fading quietly into the background. Maybe this was the universe's cruel way of forcing me forward. By the 7th week, everything was in place. Evidence secured, legal teams briefed, invitations sent. The gala would be Ethan's moment of triumph or his undoing. That evening, Daniel came to my suite one last time to finalize the details. He looked weaker now, but his spirit was unbroken. Tomorrow, he said, we take back the truth. We reviewed the plan in silence. When it was done, he smiled faintly. You've come a long way from the woman who waited quietly in that lobby. Before I could reply, my phone buzzed on the table. A message from Ethan. Mom Victoria wants to apologize. She's inviting you to lunch tomorrow. Please come. Let's fix this. I showed the screen to Sarah. Her expression darkened immediately. Don't go, she said. It's a trap. I looked down at the message again. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. Then I said quietly, let's turn their trap into ours. I didn't sleep the night before the gala. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan as a little boy standing in the kitchen doorway, his face smeared with chocolate cake, his eyes bright with pride because he'd made me a Mother's Day card out of crayon and notebook paper. Then the image would dissolve, replaced by the man in the tuxedo who had used my story to build his empire of lies. Somewhere between those two versions of my son was the truth of who he really was, and I prayed that what I was about to do wouldn't erase that last piece of him forever. By 7 in the evening, the Walker Grand Hotel had transformed into something out of a dream. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and glass, the air humming with laughter music and the scent of expensive perfume. 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits filled the room. Politicians, CEOs, journalists, donors, all of them here to celebrate the success of the Walker Hope Foundation. My name was printed across the programs, the banners, even the crystal plaques set on each table. Founder, Mary Walker Chen. I stood just outside the ballroom doors, my palms damp, my heart thudding so hard I could hear it. Sarah was beside me, her headset tucked neatly behind one ear, her calm voice the only thing holding me steady. "It's going to be fine," she said softly. "You're ready." Across the room, Daniel sat in a dark corner near the control booth. He was pale, but his eyes were clear, his expression almost peaceful. When he caught my gaze, he gave a small nod as if to remind me that this was bigger than either of us. At exactly 7:30, the double doors opened. I stepped inside. The sound in the room shifted soft murmurs, gasps, then a wave of whispers rippling like wind across water. People were recognizing me. "That's her," I heard someone say. "The lady from the photo." I walked slowly toward my seat, dressed in a simple navy gown that Sarah had chosen. No jewelry, no flash, just fabric, grace, and resolve. I kept my eyes forward, though I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on me. For once I didn't shrink under it. Ethan was across the room, surrounded by cameras and flattery. He looked magnificent, confident, in full command of the room. Victoria, dazzling in a silver Dior gown, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When he finally saw me, his smile faltered just for a second, long enough for me to see the panic flicker behind his polished mask. Victoria leaned toward him and whispered something, her smile too sweet to be kind. I caught only the edge of her voice. "Why are they treating her like a celebrity?" Ethan's lips barely moved. "I don't know. Just stick to the script." The script. That was all this night was supposed to be, a carefully written story in which I played the quiet, grateful mother, his token of humility. But the truth had been waiting a long time for its stage. At 8 sharp, the lights dimmed. The projector came to life, flooding the room with a slideshow of photographs. Me in my garden, me smiling in front of the old school where I used to volunteer, me holding roses. Pictures taken without my permission, stolen pieces of my life repurposed to sell a lie. Then, Ethan's voice boomed through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "tonight I am honored to introduce the heart of the Walker Hope Foundation. My mother, Mary Chen, is a woman who knows struggle. She raised me alone, worked 3 jobs, and never gave up." The guests applauded politely. I stood near the curtain, my fingers gripping the small backup microphone Sarah had given me, its light blinking faintly. I could hear the tremor in his voice, not of guilt, but of practiced emotion. Now he continued, smiling toward the audience. "She's dedicated her life to helping other women in need. Please welcome the founder of the Walker Hope Foundation, my mother." The applause swelled, echoing off the marble floors. Ethan gestured for me to join him on stage. For a moment, I felt every muscle in my body resist. Then I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The walk from the curtain to the stage felt longer than any distance I'd ever crossed. When I reached him, Ethan took my hand, not out of love, but performance. His palm was cold, his grip tight. He leaned toward me and whispered, "Just read the speech I gave you." I looked up at him, and for the first time, he didn't see submission in my eyes. He saw resolve. I turned to face the audience. The lights were blinding. I could see only shapes, glimmers of gold and silver faces, waiting for the fairy tale to continue. I lifted the microphone, and it went dead. The sound vanished. The room stirred in confusion. Somewhere behind me, Victoria's lips curled into a smile. I glanced toward the control booth where Sarah stood. For a second, Panic threatened to rise, but then I saw her nod once and press a button. The backup microphone in my hand crackled softly, and her voice came through my earpiece. "Mrs. Chen, you're live. The whole world is watching. Speak your truth." I looked at Ethan. His smile faltered. I turned back to the crowd. "Thank you, Ethan, for that beautiful introduction," I said, my voice calm, but carrying through the entire room. "But before we go any further, there's something all of you should know." The room went silent. "Something," I continued, "my son didn't tell you." Ethan's face froze. Victoria's hand tightened around her champagne glass. Cameras flashed. Reporters shifted forward in their seats. And somewhere in living rooms and offices across the country, 50,000 people watching the live stream leaned closer to their screens. For 30 years, I had been silent. For 30 years, I had let others tell my story, twist it, profit from it. But that night, standing under those blinding lights, I felt no fear, only the certainty that truth, once spoken, could never be taken back. I took one breath, then another, and then finally I began to speak. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the lights and the uneven rhythm of my own heartbeat. Every eye in that ballroom was on me, waiting for the usual speech, a mother's gratitude, a few tears, a polite bow. But that wasn't the story I was here to tell. "I know what it feels like to be used," I began, my voice carrying through the room. "Because 30 years ago, I lost my job, my reputation, and my livelihood for helping an innocent man prove his innocence." The words seemed to hang in the air. People shifted in their seats, unsure if they were hearing correctly. I took another breath and continued. "In 1995, I was a hotel receptionist. A man named Daniel Walker was accused of stealing money from his company. I found the proof that he hadn't, and I gave it to the police. It saved his life, but it cost me mine. I was fired, blacklisted from every hotel in Pittsburgh. My son and I were left with nothing. I washed dishes, cleaned offices, did anything I could to keep him fed." I paused, scanning the room, until I found Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We lived on donated food," I said quietly. "We had no heat in winter. I never told my son because I didn't want him to carry my shame. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't look away from him. But today, I realize he was ashamed of me anyway." The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear muffled sniffles from somewhere in the back. Even Victoria's painted smile had disappeared. I steadied myself, shifting from memory to truth. "Walker Hope Foundation," I said, "is not real." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I did not found it. I did not approve the use of my name, my face, or my story. The large LED screen behind me flickered, then came alive with slides that Sarah had prepared. The first showed an email from Victoria Use Your Mother's backstory. The single mom who struggled narrative cells. Gasps filled the room. The second slide showed financial records, millions of dollars labeled as administrative costs. The third revealed a list of investors who had been lured by Ethan's name and my supposed charity. My son stood abruptly. "Mom, what are you doing?" I didn't answer. I just let the screen speak for me. Then Victoria rose, her voice sharp and high. "This is ridiculous, Mrs. Chen. If you're so innocent, why didn't you say anything for 2 years? Why wait until now?" Her tone carried a mix of panic and arrogance. She turned to the audience. She was happy to let us use her name, and now that the money's gone, she wants to play the victim. How convenient. The room began to buzz again, uncertainty spreading like smoke. That was the moment I reached into my bag. I pulled out a small, worn envelope and took from it a photograph. I held it up high, the camera lights flashing against its surface. It was the photo that had started it all, the image of me asleep in the hotel lobby 8 weeks ago, clutching my bag and that blue scarf. "You asked why I waited," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I didn't wait, Mrs. Martin. I was waiting." I crossed the stage, my steps steady, and placed the photo on the table in front of Ethan and Victoria. This photo was taken at 2 in the morning, in this hotel. "My son booked 3 rooms that night," I said, meeting Ethan's eyes. Not one was for me. The words landed like a strike. Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came out. "I sat in that lobby for 6 hours. I continued waiting for my son to remember I existed. 50,000 people saw this photo and asked, 'Where is her family?' I asked myself the same question. I turned to Victoria, who had gone rigid in her chair. "While I waited downstairs, you and my son slept in rooms that my name, my story, and my pain helped pay for." Then I took out a second photograph, a small, faded one of Ethan at 7 years old. His arms wrapped around me in a hospital waiting room, smiling through his missing front teeth. I placed it beside the first. On the left, the boy who had promised to take care of me forever. On the right, the mother left alone in the lobby. "This," I said, touching the first photo, "is the boy who promised everything." I moved my hand to the second. "And this is the mother who's still waiting." The room was utterly silent. I looked at Ethan, and for the first time he looked small, just a frightened boy, trapped inside his own lies. "I'm not here for revenge," I said gently. "I'm here because I love you enough to tell you the truth. You've become someone I don't recognize. And I think you don't recognize yourself either." I turned to the audience. "You asked why I stayed silent for 2 years. Because for 35 years before that, I taught myself to stay quiet, to not be a burden, to not embarrass my son." But that night, sitting on that couch, I realized something. Silence doesn't protect love. It protects lies. So I'm done being silent. A ripple moved through the crowd, then applause, soft at first, then growing, rising like a wave. Ethan bowed his head, his hands covering his face, shoulders shaking. Then Sarah appeared from the side of the stage, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Sarah Walker," she said, walking to the microphone. "And I need to add something." She told her story, how she had worked for Ethan years ago, how he had blamed her for his own crime, how she had lost everything and nearly her life. The evidence flashed behind her emails, audit reports, proof of her innocence. The crowd gasped, the truth unfolding, layer by layer. And then came the final blow. Tonight, Sarah said Mrs. Victoria Martin tried to silence the truth one more time. The screen lit again, showing security footage of Victoria slipping a bribe to the sound technician backstage, the audio clip playing for all to hear. "Make sure that old woman doesn't get to speak. Cut the power when she opens her mouth." The ballroom erupted. Reporters surged forward. Victoria tried to run, but the exits were blocked. "Mrs. Martin," someone shouted. "Did you threaten your mother-in-law?" Cameras flashed. She screamed, shoved past a reporter, and stumbled as microphones crowded around her. And then, Daniel stepped onto the stage steady despite his frailness. The room hushed. "My name is Daniel Walker," he said. "I own this hotel chain." He turned toward me. 30 years ago, I was falsely accused of embezzlement. Everyone turned away from me except one person. Mrs. Mary Chen saved my life. Tonight, her own son used her to commit the same crime that once destroyed mine." He turned toward the crowd. "This charity fraud has been reported to the authorities. The investigation began 3 days ago." He lifted a folder and handed it to the front row lawyer. "All donations will be returned. And this hotel will fund a real foundation, the Mary Chen Foundation, to help single mothers honestly and with dignity. The applause that followed shook the room. I stepped back from the microphone, the lights blurring as tears filled my eyes. I didn't look at Ethan or Victoria or the flashing cameras. I just walked toward the exit, the sound of the crowd fading behind me. When I reached the lobby, the same place where I had once slept alone, I paused. The marble floor gleamed beneath my feet. My reflection stared back at me, older, steadier, free. I lifted my head and walked through. Behind me, the ballroom dissolved into chaos. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the two photographs on the table, the boy who promised everything and the mother who'd been left with nothing. And outside, through the glass doors, two black cars with the letters FBI pulled to a stop. Two agents stepped out, checked their watches, and walked inside. It was time. When I walked out of the hotel that night, the air was heavy with rain and sirens. Cameras flashed behind me, people shouted my name, but their voices blurred into one long, distant hum. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how I looked or what people would say. I just wanted to go home. My hands trembled as I unlocked my car. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, tired, yes, but something else, too. Free. The next few days passed in a strange silence. The newspapers were loud, but my life had gone quiet. The story was everywhere. Mother exposes son's charity fraud. From hero to villain, the rise and fall of Ethan Chen. The photos from the gala were printed in every magazine, me standing beside Daniel. The two pictures of Ethan and me on the table the moment everything cracked open. I didn't read them. I couldn't. By the end of that first week, the investigation had begun. The FBI arrived at Ethan's office at dawn, seizing computers, files, and boxes of documents. The IRS froze his accounts. His partners cut contact. Victoria was summoned for questioning, and within days, she had filed for divorce. Her statement to the press was short and cruel. My husband's actions were his own. I will not be associated with his deception. It should have felt like justice. It didn't. Daniel came by that Sunday bringing soup and bread like an old friend who knew food wasn't really the point. We sat by the window as the rain beat softly against the glass. My garden was still bare from neglect, the rose bushes drooping under the cold. "You haven't been out there," he said gently. "I can't," I whispered. "They were my pride. I can't look at them without thinking of what I lost." He sighed. "You didn't lose him, Mary. You stopped him from losing everyone else." I turned away, blinking hard. "He's alone, Daniel. His wife's gone, his children barely know him. He's lost his home, his name. I destroyed my own son." Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. His touch was steady, warm, despite his own frailty. "You didn't destroy him," he said softly. "You stopped him from destroying others. Sometimes love means letting them fall so they can learn to stand." His words stayed with me, but they didn't bring peace. Over the next months, the consequences unfolded piece by piece like dominoes falling in slow motion. Ethan lost everything. His company collapsed after investors withdrew. His accounts remained frozen. The penthouse was sold, the luxury cars gone. Victoria's lawyers made sure she got what little was left, along with full custody of the children. Ethan was granted visitation once a month, supervised. The court report said he appeared emotionally unstable. I read those words and felt my chest tighten. I had imagined that the truth would set us free, but truth doesn't free everyone. Sometimes it breaks the ones who built their lives on lies. By the third month, his name had become a cautionary tale in business schools, a case study on ethics and greed. The Chen collapse, they called it. Every headline drove the knife deeper. I returned to my house, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Dust had gathered on the shelves. The roses outside had wilted from months of neglect. When I stepped into the garden, the earth felt brittle under my feet. I knelt beside the rose bushes, touching the dry petals one by one. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the flowers, to the past, to the child I once held in my arms. Daniel continued to visit, though his health was declining. He'd tire quickly now, coughing into a handkerchief before smiling like it was nothing. I pretended not to notice. He always brought news from the lawyers or the investigators, though I never asked for it. One afternoon, he said quietly, "He's cooperating. Ethan. He's turning over records, helping them recover the money." I looked up. Why, maybe he's trying to make amends. But I knew the truth. It wasn't redemption he sought. It was survival. Still, I hoped that even survival might someday lead him to grace. In May, I sat at my desk for a long time before finally writing him a letter. The words came slowly, each one costing more than it should have. "Ethan, I still love you. I will always love you. But I can't protect lies anymore. What I did wasn't to hurt you. It was to save you from becoming someone I don't recognize. When you're ready to be honest with yourself, with your children, with the people you hurt, I'll be here. Love, Mom." I mailed it through Daniel's lawyer since I didn't know where he lived anymore. Days passed, then weeks. No answer came. Summer crept in quietly. My roses began to bloom again, their petals fragile but determined. I spent my mornings tending them, finding comfort in the rhythm of pruning and watering. It was the only place I could feel peace among things that grew again after dying back. Daniel still visited when he could, his strength fading, but his humor intact. "You see," he'd say, watching me in the garden, "even roses know when to let go of what's dead." One evening in June, 6 months after the gala, the phone rang. It was Sarah. "My father's staying late at the office," she said. "He called me earlier, sounded tired, but happy. I think he's finally at peace with everything." That same night, Daniel left his office and saw a car parked across the street from the Walker Grand Hotel. The headlights were off, but the engine was running. Inside sat a man, motionless, staring up at the building. Daniel walked closer, his steps slow, and when he saw who it was, his heart broke. It was Ethan. He was holding a worn photograph himself as a boy, his arm around me. Both of us smiling like the world was simple. His shoulders shook silently, his face wet with tears. Later, Daniel told me he didn't approach. He just stood there watching as my son looked up at the hotel lights, the same lights that had once cast their glow on lies and shame and truth. Ethan stayed there for hours unmoving, as if he were waiting for something or someone that he no longer knew how to reach. And as Daniel told me this, I closed my eyes and whispered, "He must lose everything to learn anything." It hurt to say it. But in that moment, I knew it was true. I didn't know then how deeply those words would root themselves in me. The summer after the gala was slow and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels both comforting and hollow. I spent my mornings in the garden again. The soil was dry, but it still remembered me. The roses I thought had died began to push out new green shoots, fragile but alive. I planted 20 more bushes, each one for a single mother I had taught or comforted or simply listened to over the years. It became a ritual of renewal. Every morning I would water them and whisper small blessings under my breath. It helped me believe that even what is broken can bloom again. Daniel and Sarah visited often. Daniel looked thinner, paler. The cough came more often now, and sometimes he'd hide the tremor in his hands by tucking them under the table. but he still smiled the same way, warm, patient, like he'd seen too much to ever lose faith in second chances. We'd sit on the porch drinking tea, talking about everything except Ethan. When Sarah came, she would bring pies and chatter about the hotel renovations. I knew she did it to fill the silence that still hung between me and my son's name. By July's end, I had returned to the community center to teach English to immigrant mothers. Standing in front of that class, watching women struggle to pronounce simple words with such courage, I felt something inside me begin to knit together. Teaching had always been my way back to myself. These women carried stories like mine of sacrifice, loneliness, and fierce, unyielding love. They reminded me that redemption rarely arrives as glory. It comes as small acts of persistence. In August, Daniel showed up at my door holding a plain white envelope. His eyes were softer than usual, a kind of gentleness that comes with sorrow. "This fell out of Ethan's pocket," he said quietly. "He was sitting outside the hotel again last month. I think he wanted you to read it." I hesitated before taking it. The handwriting was familiar even before I unfolded the paper, slanted, deliberate, a little uneven. Ethan's. My breath caught as I began to read. "Mom, I was blinded by success and forgot who I was. I forgot that being poor didn't make you weak. It made you the strongest person I've ever known. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even deserve to call you Mom. But I'm trying. I'm trying to become someone you can be proud of again. E." The words blurred through my tears. I pressed the letter to my chest, and for the first time in many months, I let myself cry without anger. It was a cry of release. He hadn't sent it, but he had written it. That meant something. Daniel watched me quietly. When I finally looked up, he said, "He's trying, Mary. I've been keeping tabs on him, not to punish him, to see if he's learning." I listened as Daniel told me what he knew. Ethan had gone to the investigators himself, turning over additional records that even they hadn't found. He'd sold the last thing of value he owned, his Rolex, and sent the money to 3 of the earliest investors he'd defrauded, each with a handwritten note of apology. He had even gone to see Sarah. He knelt, Daniel said softly. Told her he was sorry. "Did she forgive him?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. She told him, if you mean it, prove it. Help someone the way you hurt me." I closed my eyes, imagining the scene, my proud, broken son on his knees before the woman he'd wronged. It hurt to think of him humbled, but it also healed something in me to know he was finally ashamed of the right things. By September, the results of the investigation were public. Ethan was officially convicted of charity and wire fraud. He would serve 5 years of probation instead of prison cooperation, and restitution had spared him jail. The court ordered full repayment of $2.3 million and banned him from serving on any corporate board for 10 years. When I heard the sentence on the radio, I sat still for a long time, then whispered, "At least he won't go to jail. He still has a chance." Victoria's punishment was lighter, but her name was gone from every social circle she once ruled. I didn't take satisfaction in it. The older I grew, the less joy I found in anyone's downfall. The days grew shorter, the air cooler. My garden filled with roses again, deep crimson and soft white. Each bloom felt like forgiveness whispered into the wind. I often sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sky shift from gold to gray, wondering if Ethan ever thought of me. Then one afternoon in late September, the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice carried the same mix of weariness and warmth I'd come to know so well. "Mary," he said slowly, "Ethan is here, at my office." I stopped breathing for a moment. "He's been waiting for 4 hours," Daniel continued. "He says he won't leave until he sees you. He says he's ready to face you." The room felt suddenly smaller, quieter. The ticking clock grew loud. Daniel's voice softened. "Mary, are you ready to face him?" I looked out the window at the garden, the late afternoon sun glinting off the petals. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of all the years between us. "I don't know," I whispered, "but maybe it's time I find out." The next morning, I found myself standing once again in front of the Walker Grand Hotel. The same revolving doors, the same marble floors, the same chandelier that had once looked down on me as I slept, forgotten beneath its light. Time hadn't changed the place, but it had changed me. I wasn't the same woman who once sat in that lobby with a paper bag of gifts and a heart full of denial. I was steadier now, quieter, but stronger too. The kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. Ethan was already there when I walked in. He was sitting on the same corner sofa where I had waited 8 months earlier. For a moment, the memory hit me like a wave, the ache in my spine, the humiliation, the silence, but then I looked at him and saw someone else. He was thinner, his suit replaced by a plain white shirt and worn jeans. His hair had more gray in it, and his eyes, once sharp with arrogance, looked tired, searching. When he saw me, he stood quickly, his lips parting like he wasn't sure how to begin. "Mom," he said softly. The word caught in his throat. "Thank you for coming. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I nodded and gestured for him to sit. I took the seat across from him, the same distance that had once separated us by pride instead of space. "I'm listening," I said. He exhaled shakily, his hands trembling slightly. After that night, I lost everything he began. My job, my wife, my home. But the worst part was, I lost myself. He stared at his hands for a long moment before continuing. For weeks, I couldn't get out of bed. I sat in that apartment staring at the ceiling, trying to remember where it went wrong. And then I remembered that day at the hotel when I was 10, the day you begged the manager for the paycheck they owed you. I thought you were weak then. I thought strength was about never needing anyone. But Mom, you were the only one strong enough to stand up when everyone else stayed silent. His voice cracked. I spent 25 years running from your strength because it reminded me of everything I hated in myself. I told myself I'd never be like you. But the truth is, I wish I was half the person you are. I felt something deep inside me shift. For so many years, I dreamed of hearing words like these, but I never imagined they would sound so broken, so real. "What have you been doing these past 10 months, Ethan?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, then reached down and lifted a worn cardboard box from beside his chair. "I've been doing this." He slid it across the table toward me. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each one labeled with a name. "There are 27 letters," he said, "from women you helped over the years. I found them." I looked up at him, stunned. "I went to the community center," he explained. "I asked the coordinator for a list of students you taught or women you helped. She gave me 5 names. From those 5, I found 27. It took 4 months. I drove across 3 states." He laughed softly, but it wasn't a proud sound. It was the sound of someone who still couldn't quite believe what they'd done. "I gave each woman back the money you'd lent them. Double, actually. Some didn't even remember owing you anything. One of them, her name was Mrs. Gutierrez. She said you'd helped her buy medicine for her daughter. Her daughter's in college now. When I handed her the check, she started crying. She said, 'Your mother gave me hope when I had none.'" He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. I didn't know what to say. I just told her I was there to honor that hope. He reached into the box again and pulled out a small envelope. "This one's from her. She wanted me to give it to you." I opened it and found a note written in careful cursive. "Your son came to me in tears. He said, 'My mother gave you hope when you had none. I'm here to honor that hope. He paid for my daughter's tuition, Mrs. Chen. Thank you for raising him.'" My throat closed. I set the letter down and looked at my son, the boy I once carried through every hardship, the man who had built his success on lies, and the man now sitting before me, trying to rebuild himself, one truth at a time. Ethan's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Last month I met a woman named Clara at a food bank. She's a single mom, works 2 jobs. Her son's 10. He paused, his voice shaking. I saw him waiting outside in the cold, and I saw me. I saw the boy I used to be. Angry, ashamed of his mother for working too hard." He wiped his face. "I gave Clara $5,000, the last of what I had left after selling my watch. I told her son, 'Your mother is a hero. Never forget that.' And when I said it, I finally understood what you were trying to teach me all those years ago." I stood then. Slowly, carefully, I walked to him. He looked up startled, as if unsure whether I'd come to comfort or condemn. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath his skin. "You're finding your way home, Ethan," I whispered, "and I'm proud of you." He broke then, folding into my arms like the boy he once was. We stayed that way for a long moment. No words, just the sound of 2 hearts finding their rhythm again after years of silence. As we held each other, there was a soft knock at the door. Sarah stepped inside, her smile, small but kind. Beside her stood a young boy clutching a hand-drawn card. "This is Clara's son," she said gently. "He wanted to bring you something." The boy walked forward and handed Ethan the card. On it was a drawing of a woman holding a little boy's hand under a bright sun with the words in uneven letters, "Thank you for helping my mom." Ethan knelt down, taking the card in his hands, his tears falling onto the paper. He looked up at me, eyes full of something new, not guilt, not pride, but understanding. And in that moment, I realized redemption isn't about apologies or punishment. It's about becoming the person you should have been all along. 18 months later, I stood once again in front of the Walker Grand Hotel, but this time it wasn't to wait or to confront. It was to celebrate. The morning sun washed the courtyard in gold, and before me stretched a small garden filled with roses in every shade of pink, red, and white. A wooden archway stood at the entrance, carved with the words, "Mary's Garden." Beneath it a plaque read, "Where dignity blooms, hope grows." I never imagined my name would rest on a sign like that. This wasn't about fame or redemption. It was about peace, about turning something painful into something that could grow. Around me, more than 50 women and their children gathered, mothers who had struggled, as I once did, children running between rose bushes, their laughter echoing against the marble walls of the hotel that had once felt so cold. Now it was warm, alive. Ethan was there too, wearing jeans and a pale blue shirt rolled at the sleeves. He was thinner but healthy, his movements unhurried, his eyes gentler than I'd ever known them to be. For the past 6 months, he'd been working full-time as the community coordinator for the garden. His salary was modest, less than he once spent on a watch, but I'd never seen him look prouder. Every morning, he arrived early to open the gates, water. The plants organized schedules for the single mothers who attended our job training classes. Some days he swept the paths himself. Other days he simply sat on the bench by the fountain, talking to women who needed to be heard. He no longer drove luxury cars. He took the bus sometimes with me beside him, the two of us holding paper coffee cups and talking quietly as the city passed by. On weekends, he saw his children. His daughter, 7, now often visited the garden and loved to help me prune the roses. Once, she asked her father, "Daddy, why do you work in a garden?" And Ethan smiled and said, "Because Grandma taught me that the most beautiful things grow from the hardest ground." I looked at him that day and saw not the boy I raised or the man who betrayed me, but someone in between, a man, still learning, still trying, still growing. And I realized that was enough. Daniel lived long enough to see it all. He came to the garden's groundbreaking frail but radiant, leaning on Sarah's arm. When he saw Ethan and me standing side by side, his eyes filled with quiet satisfaction. A few weeks before he passed, he called me to his bedside. His hand, thin but steady, found mine. "I repaid my debt. Mary," he whispered, "and you saved 2 lives mine 30 years ago, and your son's now." He died peacefully at 67, leaving behind more than a business empire. In his will, he endowed Mary's Garden Fund with $5 million and created the Mary Walker Chen Scholarship for children of struggling families. The penthouse, the same one where I once found refuge that night, was renamed the Mary Walker Suite, now reserved for single mothers in crisis who needed temporary housing. Sarah took over the Walker Hotel Group, but she never lost her father's humility. When she spoke at Daniel's memorial, she said, "My father always believed courage changes more lives than power." He learned that from Mary Chen. And now, standing at the ribbon cutting of Mary's garden, Sarah spoke again. 30 years ago, she said, her voice clear, a woman named Mary Chen lost everything because she did the right thing. Today, she's given that loss meaning. She taught us that dignity doesn't fade when life humbles you. It blooms when you stand back up. When it was my turn to speak, the crowd grew quiet. I looked out at their faces. Some I knew, many I didn't, but in every one I saw a reflection of my younger self. I took a breath. "I learned that being left in the lobby isn't the end of your story," I said. "It's where your real story begins. Dignity isn't about where you sleep or how much money you have. It's about who you are when no one's watching." My voice trembled slightly as I turned toward Ethan. "And forgiveness," I added, "isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing a mother and a son can give." The applause was soft at first, then grew until it filled the garden like a tide. Ethan walked to me, holding a small rose sapling. Together, we planted it in the center of the garden, a white rose, pure and bright. It was our beginning. That evening, after the guests left, we stayed behind. The sun was setting, bathing the garden in soft amber light. We sat on a wooden bench near the fountain, watching children chase each other between the flowers. Ethan turned to me and asked quietly, "Mom, do you ever think about that night? When I left you in the lobby, I smiled, the memory no longer sharp, but softened by time. Every day," I said, "but not with anger anymore, with gratitude." He looked puzzled. "Gratitude?" I nodded slowly, because that night I stopped being silent, and you started listening. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned his head against my shoulder. We sat there together as the sky deepened to gold, then rose, then purple. The air smelled of roses, of rain, of everything we'd lost and found again. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, I whispered almost to myself, "Sometimes being left behind is how you find your way home." And somewhere above the city lights in the penthouse, now named for a woman who once had nothing, forgiveness finally felt like home. And that was the story of Mary's Garden, a story of pain that turned into purpose, of a mother who was once left behind and a son who finally found his way home. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know what part stayed with you the most. Was it the night in the hotel lobby when Mary's silence finally broke? Or the moment years later when she planted that white rose with Ethan, proving that forgiveness can bloom even from heartbreak? Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to make things right, never too late to choose love over pride, and never too late to rebuild what's been broken. So tell me in the comments, have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply? Or maybe, have you ever needed that forgiveness yourself? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, stories that remind us of the quiet strength of family, of second chances, and of the healing power of truth, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who might need it tonight. Because sometimes one story can help another heart find its way home.